The Fed said we're going to be on a pause on cutting interest rates. And that was kind of the backdrop getting us set for all of the tariff uncertainty. I think if the tariff uncertainty calms down, the Fed will be thinking, let's start planning on the interest rate cuts, but they're not going to quite do it right away. They're going to want to see that inflation has come down. It's going to be hard for the Fed to figure this out with tariffs.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Keys to Real Estate. I'm your host, Mary Schuster. We're excited to bring you a special guest today, Dr. Bill Conerly. He's a business economics consultant who helps companies tool up to their best abilities in any economic market. He's a terrific public speaker. His book is titled The Flexible Stance, Thriving in a Boom or Bust Economy. And since the world of real estate seems to be either feast or famine, we thought he was the perfect economist to help you chart your company safely through these interesting economic times. So let's get underway. Please enjoy the perspectives and wisdom of Dr. Bill Conerly. The presenting sponsor for this season of Keys to Real Estate is Closing Lock. Working in title, do you ever feel like you've got a target on your back? Every year, $2 trillion moves in and out of escrow accounts in the United States. Fraudsters are watching and waiting for one wrong click, one unsecured email, just one oversight. And then just like that, your client's life savings are gone. That's where Closing Lock comes in. Closing Lock provides title companies a secure, all-in-one platform to prevent fraud, protect funds, and streamline closings. Over 1 million home sales have closed safely without incident in Closing Lock. Fraudsters only have to be right once. Title companies have to be right every time. Closing Lock has your back. Visit closinglock.com today to learn more. Dr. Conerly, welcome to Keys to Real Estate. We're so glad to have you here.
You know, it's great to be here on a show focused on helping real estate professionals. So I'll see if I can help.
I bet you can. We have a lot to talk through. We're watching a lot of headlines right now about GDP and interest rates and inflation and, of course, housing. All of that impacts housing, and housing is impacting a lot of other things right now. And it can be tough to sort of make sense of what's noise and what's good signal, like what really matters. So I want to talk about each element of that, but I'd like to start with, if we could, your big picture view and ask you, how would you characterize the current state of the U.S. economy?
I think right now, and we're recording this in late May 2025, right now the economy is in good shape, but we're very nervous about uncertainty due to tariffs. Even if tariffs had been announced and we had a final deal that was super high, say 30% average tariffs coming from, 3% the previous year, we could have dealt with that. Would have been a minor blip, but right now the biggest worry I have is the uncertainty and how long will we not know what the tariffs are going to be.
Yes, and I want to talk a lot about tariffs specifically because just they impact so much of the economy as inputs. And so I want to get to that section. But I'm happy to hear you say that we're overall strong, still nervously strong. That's good. Let's look at some elements if we could. Let's talk about economic growth and recession risk. We're starting to see, as you mentioned, we are sitting here at the end of May. We're looking for some next quarter numbers to see where we're at. So what are the signs that you're watching when you're determining whether the economy is headed to recession or just experiencing a soft patch? And also, we've seen some reports of some sluggish GDP. And so is that something we should be concerned about, or is it more of a technical blip? Let's look at those two things if we can.
Yeah. And Mary, may I
please
pause a little bit before answering the question and say, if you're running a business, I know business leaders tell me that they feel like they ought to keep up with the economy better than they do. Okay. But the fact is, if you're running a business, you've got 1,000 details to handle. And going news lean, maybe not completely news sober, is not a bad strategy. And so I'll hit the highlights and maybe provide justification for just skipping the news for the next
Well, thank you for
so.
that permission. I need that justification because otherwise you can get pretty frizzed out pretty quick.
Yeah, and I meet people who read every detailed story about what may happen, and it's a rabbit hole. So here's the big picture that I think you can roll with for quite a while. We came out of 2024, the overall economy, very solid. And if nothing else had changed, I would have said, hey, we're going to have another solid year, about average growth rate of the economy, which is 2% after you do an inflation adjustment. The first quarter GDP number came in slightly negative, but the first quarter numbers are always based on partial information. And as we get more information, I think it's going to be revised upward a little bit. But a lot of what was going on in the first quarter was weirdness with buying imported goods in anticipation of tariffs. So we started to see the turmoil there. And now we are seeing some businesses delaying decisions on capital spending. Should we buy the new equipment? We had plans on building another warehouse, or we were going to fill these 3 empty positions, but maybe we should just wait a little bit. And if enough people wait and see, you get into a recession. So I'm not forecasting a recession, but that is based on the assumption that we get some certainty about tariff levels coming this summer. And if we do, I think that'll be fine. Consumers have money in the bank. They still have not spent all of the stimulus checks they got back in 2020 and 2021. Unemployment is low. Job growth has been fine, maybe not super fine, but we don't really have enough labor for a lot more job growth.
Right.
And we ought to put that on the list of things to talk about.
I'd love to talk about that.
So when I look at sort of the broad scope of the economy, I feel good except for the tariff uncertainty. And then the Federal Reserve is wondering what to do. You want to talk about interest rates, or you want to defer that?
I want to talk about interest rates because that one's obviously real critical for our industry. So let's talk about that. The Fed's policy, rates, inflation. Let's kind of cover that territory.
Yeah. Well, the Federal Reserve ignored inflation until inflation slapped the Fed across the side of the face. And they started raising interest rates. Last fall, like August and September of 2024, the Fed was saying, gee, maybe it's time to cut. They started cutting interest rates in anticipation of a job market weakness. And then the last few months of last year, no weakness showed. So the Fed says, oops, we don't have to worry about job losses from our higher interest rates. But inflation was stubborn. Inflation had come down a lot, but it was above the Fed's target by 0.6%. Not a lot, but the Fed really wants to hit that target for the credibility of having set a target and then hit it. So the Fed said, we're going to be on a pause on cutting interest rates. And that was kind of the backdrop getting us set for all of the tariff uncertainty. I think if the tariff uncertainty calms down, the Fed will be thinking, let's start planning on the interest rate cuts, but they're not going to quite do it right away. They're going to want to see that inflation has come down. And if I can ramble on, it's going to be hard for the Fed to figure this out with tariffs, because tariffs people call them inflationary. Most of us economists don't use that word, because what the tariffs will do is a one-time increase in the price level, whereas inflation is sort of year after year after year after year, the price level goes up. But tariffs are a sudden jump up. And the Fed has studied what to do if you get a sudden jump up in the price level. And they've concluded, and I agree, they should just ignore that. Let it happen. And if it's truly a one-time jump. So I think the Fed won't react to price levels going up. The public is going to be unhappy, and the public doesn't want to lecture on economics. I have verified that empirically.
But we do, because we have to plan for our business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and that you're right. Last fall, we really thought, okay, here we go. And Bill, I have friends and colleagues who own small title companies that haven't paid themselves in 3 years. Like, it's bad. People are,
Yeah.
people are hanging on. And so we thought, okay, well, hold up. But then, yep, well, we have an administration change to have happen. And so let's let that get in and get settled. And then we thought, all right, here come the cuts. Well, no. But some folks are predicting still 3 to 5 cuts this year. And I'm like, I don't know, guys. It doesn't sound like you think that's probably likely either.
I've been doubtful about that. I know my colleagues are there, but I think that with the stubborn inflation, the Fed is just going to sit tight. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and prices, when you abstract from tariffs, the inflation rate will edge down. And if that happens, then I'm wrong, and the Fed will be cutting interest rates. But I've gotten frustrated, as has the Fed, with inflation being stubborn. I'm always frustrated by stubborn people.
Yeah, well, because they're frustrating. Yeah, there's so much pent up demand, and it's always tricky in this business because it literally is blow doors off. You can't even go home and sleep at night,
Yeah.
or famine. And I know as soon as we get even a little bit, it's going to be crazy busy time again, and everybody's starving for that. They're ready, but yeah, there's so many elements that have to come into view just right for that to happen. And it just sounds like we don't have that certainty yet. I'm also wondering about, you mentioned jobs earlier, and that they were kind of doing pretty good, or at least steady and holding. But we're starting to see some reports about layoffs happening. I'm wondering what you're looking forward to about that.
Yeah. Well, we always have layoffs in a dynamic economy. Even if the economy is growing, there are some companies in the old sectors of the economy, the old industries, that are cutting back. And there are companies that are just poorly managed. Other companies are hiring, taking on, they're in the hot sectors, or they're well managed. So I don't pay too much attention to the newspaper headlines of layoffs. I look at things like the first claim for unemployment insurance. So somebody gets laid off, there's typically a week waiting period. Some people take a little bit longer, but you can monitor that week by week. And we have been at historic lows, and the numbers have crept up a little bit, but they're still well below the long run average. So I'm not at all worried about layoffs.
Okay. Well, I would like to go back to tariffs for a little bit, if we can do a little deeper
Sure.
dive there, because you're right. And the employment, the number of people in the employment world impacts our housing prices too. But certainly many of these tariffs could, with the value add, right? With the inputs coming on to so many of the products we need to build houses. And how much inventory do you think we're short? How many units?
I don't know. I haven't done a number on that.
Yeah. Because
But let me comment
yeah.
on the tariffs and costs, and then maybe we
Okay.
come back to the overall market and how much excess demand for housing there is. I was talking to a friend of mine who's an electrician. I asked him how many and he does new construction projects, non-residential. But I said, how much of what you install is imported? And he rubbed his chin and thought, and he said, I'm not sure if it's 99% or 100%. There may be one or two American made oddball things, but it's at least 99%. A lot of plumbing materials as well, and nails, fasteners, all come from overseas. Now, most of the cost of like building a house is the land, the labor, the permits. They're not subject to tariffs. The permits you might consider a tariff by themselves.
Some do consider them a tariff, yeah.
That's a political comment. So definitely tariffs will bump up the cost of new construction and the cost of remodeling, but not by a huge amount. We're talking a few percent probably.
Well, then when we kind of look at all kinds of real estate activity, residential, commercial, conversions from one to the other, people are getting creative with manufactured housing. I would love to just let you jam on what you see ahead, from immediacy to, let's say, six months out, 12 months out,
Sure.
so that our business owners and our workers can start to think about how to do some real planning for their business.
Yeah, I am less optimistic about the long run on residential than many people in the industry are, and I'll tell you why. A lot of people look backwards at new construction, that we were doing, 1 million single family homes plus a bunch of more multifamily. That was an era when the US population was growing rapidly. And our population growth has really slowed down. Some of it's birth, some of it's immigration. And I like to look at housing units relative to the change in population rather than just what we used to do back in the old days. And it's a little hard to tell on the population numbers. We had strong total increase of population in the Biden administration, particularly the last 2 years of the Biden administration, with a lot of immigrants coming in, welcoming to migrants. That, of course, is going away very quickly. And it was actually going away in the last 6 months of the Biden administration. So I'm not looking for a lot of population growth. Now, there's certainly some old housing that needs to be replaced, and also a shift in housing in terms of some states are not growing much. California has had actually a net outflow of population most of the last few years. But you and I were both in Florida earlier this month, Texas, and there are some states that are booming. So it doesn't do any good to say, oh, there are plenty of housing units available in the city of Detroit when people want to live in Florida.
Yeah.
But I think that keeping in mind the population change is an important factor. And then we have a fair amount of flexibility on how many people live in a housing unit. Do the adult children get kicked out of the basement? Do young adults have roommates or not? There was a time when I couldn't afford my own place. And then there was a time when I could live without a roommate. Hallelujah.
But that place wasn't that great. The definition of a starter home has changed too, I think, in all fairness.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's another thing, is that if you look at the sort of bottom 20% of the American public, they live in more square feet than the average European. And they've got air conditioning. A lot of Europe still doesn't believe in air conditioning. But we have certain standards. Instead of being grumpy old folks and saying kids these days don't understand how good they have it, we ought to just look at what's going to happen in the future.
Right. Well, and they're grumpy with us. Pause there for 1 second, because they're grumpy with us too, because their contention is that we won't get out of the way. We won't get out of our, maybe not our empty nest house, but our house that we did later adulthood in. So, because I think they think that the prices are being kept artificially high. And some of that may be true without enough movement, but it's also true of, well, this house should be your someday house, not your start here house. I'm sure they think that they would ripple all the way down, but I'm not sure we've set this generation up, if we can be grumpy old folks for just a minute more. I'm not sure we've set these folks up to really think about what your first home, either rental and eventually purchase, is really like. I think they feel like it's kind of like it should feel like walking into their parents' house. And it's like, oh, no. If you set something down on the floor, it might run clear to the other end of the house. That's what we mean when we mean our first home.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't know, or I think it's true.
I think it's
true.
And
of course, everybody varies a little bit,
sure.
But I don't know, as an economist, I don't know the solution to that.
Okay, that's fair.
There's probably somebody in the audience who
maybe they'll write us in, Bill, and let us know.
Right. Yeah. But one of the challenges that we're having now is there is a significant lack of move up home buyers. They got their starter home in the second half of 2020 or in 2021 or early 2022, because instead of waiting another 5 years, they got a 3-point-something% mortgage. And now they've got the income to move up, but they do the numbers and they abandon a 3% mortgage and go to a 7% mortgage. And
changes the equation.
That burns up all the money they have for improving. And I think that I'm not really here to criticize the Federal Reserve, but let me take a moment and say, I don't think they had a clue what the long-term effects of such low mortgage rates would be. They just pushed money into mortgages, and we will be for years paying the price in reduced mobility. There will be people who won't take jobs in another city, and people who won't leave their little tiny house because they've got the 3% mortgage. And that's going to mean fewer starter homes on the market.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because, our industry tends to really yearn for the lower the rates, the better, because obviously the volume happens. But yeah, when that party comes to an end, for whatever reason, you're right that the paralysis that ensues afterwards is not something that a lot of people will acknowledge. And then, as with anything else, how you think about the price tag really comes a lot from what you're used to. And some of these the youngs don't know anything more than 2 or 3% money. They just don't know. And so 6, 7 just sounds like highway robbery. And it is practically comparatively too much, but to us, it's like, oh, well, that's still pretty good.
Yeah. And we can go on about my first mortgage.
Yeah, exactly.
But even in the corporate world, when the Fed raised interest rate, there were corporate treasurers with 10 years experience who had never seen rising borrowing costs, and they're financing inventory or, other working capital needs. And they're like, we're not used to interest rates going up.
There were a couple banks that got caught up in that same problem too. That's another story. Go ahead.
And let me address a comment to the real estate professionals
Yep.
who enjoyed the boom with that, 3% mortgage era. That was not normal.
No.
If it's not obvious to you, that was not normal, and we're never going back to those days. Even if you exercise regularly and watch your blood pressure, I don't think you'll live long enough to see an era like that again.
Well, and some folks that work in this industry didn't see their children for several years. So they, but yes, it's somewhere between the feast and famine, somewhere that Goldilocks point we always look for that we never find. So I love, and one of the reasons I wanted you to come on as our guest today was I love how you look at it so pragmatically, and you're neither everything's hunky and dory nor the sky is falling. It's here's what we have. Let's understand why it's that way, the things that could impact, and then also now let's get busy charting our course of how we're going to deal with it. And I want to get into that with you later, but just understanding these elements, it's so, I think, healthy to not come at it of, well, we might as well all retire, or, hey, it's not as bad as you think, everybody. Just some good, where are we? It's so important.
Yeah. The great philosopher Billy Joel said something like, the good old days weren't all that good, and tomorrow's not as bad as it seems.
That is so true. And I feel like those are especially good words of wisdom right now. What do you think about the commercial side of things? So are we going back to work? Are we going to need to build office buildings anytime soon, or repurpose other things, or what's that looking like?
Yeah, I do scan the non-residential world, and the first thing that I see is huge variation from city to city.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit hesitant to make a generalization, but I'll make a couple. But I'd suggest to everybody, if you're focused on one city, you need to understand that that place. Central core offices in most places not doing very well. High vacancy rate. I think the national average is 20 something, maybe 24%, something ridiculously high. And yeah, you need some vacancy so that companies can move in and move around, but you don't need that much. In many communities, suburban office is doing better. And some of that is healthcare offices, and some of it is people not wanting to go downtown. So, I live in the Portland, Oregon metropolitan area, which was pretty harshly hit by riots, crime, homelessness. And there are people who, if they have to see an attorney, an insurance agent, or title insurance person, used to go downtown, and now they'd much rather go down the street. So suburban office, depending on the city, doing somewhat better. Industrial boomed a few years ago when everybody went to Amazon, and some of that was Amazon and some of that was other online businesses. So the warehouse side really boomed, and the real estate developers, bless their hearts, they said, oh, you want more warehouse? We'll build more warehouse. And now they're overbuilt, not as badly as office, but they're having to dial back on new development. Rents are coming down in many parts of the warehouse world. And retail, I think if you're looking for opportunity, I think that there are many, many places that are underbuilding retail, like strip centers, not so much the big mega malls, but there's a lot of lean vacancy rates around the country in retail. And some of the slack, some stores have closed without a doubt, but I'm seeing more yoga studios, more gyms, more various kinds of exercise, a ceramic studio here and there, recreational
services and
activities.
recreation,
In retail is propping that up as well.
Well, that's interesting because seeing a kind of a little resurgence in services and recreation makes me that supports your earlier statement that basically we're chugging along pretty okay, because when times are truly hard, those businesses don't do well.
Yeah. And one of the things that happened that was highlighted by the pandemic was the shift from stuff to services. And at one point, as people's average income went up, wealth went up, they wanted another sport coat, another dress, a second car. And now the closet is bulging with stuff that I don't wear. You're probably more responsible as a
I'm
consumer.
entirely irresponsible in this area. You picked a very high area of irresponsibility for me. Go ahead. I am the case study on this one.
But what we want social connection.
Yes.
And yeah, you can do yoga at home, but a lot of people like to go to the yoga class, or they have a personal trainer that they spend time with. And it's just sort of a stage of economic development that people go for more services as they have higher income. And also, I think to some extent, as they age, and we have the baby boom generation, a huge generation aging, and, more and more folks of that age are recognizing their kids don't want their stuff. They shouldn't be buying more stuff, but they want to do stuff. They're healthier than their grandparents had been at that age.
Yeah.
So I think the service sector of retail is going to continue to be strong.
Yeah, experience based. Yeah, I think a lot of people got that. Yes, I agree. During the pandemic, they went, "What? I'm sitting around with all my stuff, and it's not making me happy. So can I go out and engage with people, do something I like to do, and spend my time and money differently?" A lot of people came out of the pandemic doing things very differently.
Hey, we talked about interest rates, but we didn't go into mortgages and how that is a little bit different than the overall interest rate environment. Maybe we ought to cue that up at some point.
Let's do it.
You want to do it now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So when the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, they do not change mortgage rates directly. They change a short-term rate, an overnight rate. And that tends to affect things like the 10-year Treasury bond, a long-term rate, but it's still government. And then that is used as a base to price mortgage securities. And we're seeing a couple of weird things going on right now. One is that some foreign investors are wondering about buying Treasury securities. The U.S. credit rating was recently downgraded. I don't think the credit rating itself will cause much change because it's based on publicly available information that anybody anywhere in the world can look at and see, oh, we've got a big deficit. It's growing. We're not doing anything about it. But there's been an effort by foreign countries holding bonds to not quite get rid of their dollar-denominated securities, but want to diversify into euros, yen. I haven't heard of anybody wanting much in the way of the Chinese yuan, but they're looking for alternatives. And that may have helped push U.S. Treasury rates up a little bit, just a little bit. But the thing that I find even more interesting is what's going on with mortgages, because there's been a historic spread where the 30-year mortgage was the 10-year Treasury plus about 160 basis points on average, plus or minus, and it varies a little bit. But the spread is pretty wide now. And what's going on seems to be that there are institutional investors. They're investing the life insurance money that people have paid that they won't have to put the money out for a while, or university endowments with a really long-term perspective. And these investment managers are saying, hey, interest rates are kind of high. Let's lock it in.
Yeah.
And a treasury bond locks it in. A mortgage doesn't lock in high interest rates, because you know that when mortgage rates come down, everybody with a 7% mortgage is going to say, oh, is it time to refi? And those Wall Street investment managers are going to say, oh, I bought a mortgage-backed security and it's paying me my principal back when interest rates are low. I don't want my principal back when interest rates are low. I wouldn't mind having my principal back if interest rates had risen, but that never happens in the mortgage market. So to get an investor to take a mortgage-backed security, there has to be a fairly large premium. But I think that's going to shrink a little bit. So I actually have mortgage rates coming down, maybe just 0.25% relative to treasuries, because I think that the investors will be less convinced we're going to get a big interest rate drop. In fact, I think that the investors are going to slap their heads and say, by golly, Bill Conerly was right, and interest rates are not coming down a lot. And that will narrow the spread on.
That's really interesting. All right. So that's certainly something to be watching for. Like to just kind of, for people listening, again, they're business owners and they're professionals that are working in real estate, lending, title settlement, all of that. So I'd love to hear what you are going to be watching with respect to the next 6 to 12 months and what they should be watching. What's noise and what's signal to look out for?
Yeah, two separate questions, what I'm going to watch and what I recommend other people watch. As part of my routine, I watch everything. So if there's an economic statistic that you're seeing on the tube, I've already looked at the numbers fresh from the government. So I look at everything. But the things I'm going to be focusing on most are, what is the level of tariff uncertainty? And that's going to be the big thing. And we economists, ever since Adam Smith wrote his magnum opus in 1776, we have thought tariffs are bad public policy. But it's one thing to say, hey, tariffs not good policy. It's another thing to say, how bad is it? And when I actually run through the numbers, even high tariffs are only a little bad for the economy, but I think the uncertainty is very bad. And so I'm going to be watching that. The secondary thing I'm going to look at is the inflation rate. Is the inflation rate coming down enough for the Federal Reserve to feel comfortable? And is unemployment creeping up? Because the Federal Reserve has what they call a dual mandate. Congress set up the Federal Reserve and said, keep inflation low and employment high. And the Fed will be watching those two things. So those will be probably the three things that I focus on most. But I think that the average business leader needs a quick summary and keep up with it. I have a little plug. I put out a monthly newsletter in graphical format once a month. It's like a 60 to 90 second summary of what's going on in the economy. And we can throw instructions on how to get that in the show notes.
Yeah, we sure will. We will link that through in the show notes so that people can, that sounds like the perfect kind of Reader's Digest way to understand the down and dirty and keep going with your business. That's really good. Well, thank you so much for helping our audience understand much of what's going on. And to your point, what you look like as an economist, as a professional, and what they need to be concerned about, because as we said at the top, it just can get so dizzying. And thanks for helping us educate folks so that they can maintain their sanity a little better.
Great to be with you, Mary.
Well, that wraps up part one. And thanks, Bill, for the excellent advice. Audience, next time we'll bring you part two of our conversation, where Bill will share thoughts on future-proofing your operations. And in it, we talk about updating your posture when it comes to labor issues, leadership methods, and for building long-term strategies. Now, in the meantime, Bill's contact information is linked in today's show notes. So if you need a terrific educational speaker for an event coming up, I can highly recommend checking out his website for details. And as always, stay with us at October Research for timely news impacting your business, because no matter the market conditions, it's always true that knowledge is your competitive advantage.